Welcome to the Materials chapter. In this chapter, we'll start by smoothing out our mesh to avoid any harsh faceting or artifacts, and then we'll look at a way to bypass Blender's default smoothing method in order to ensure our flat surfaces stay flat. We'll then look at getting our hands dirty with some shader work in order to create some procedural edge, dirt, roughness, and scratch material masks. And being mathematically generated, these shader masks benefit from certain things, like being resolution independent, so we never get any unwanted pixelation, having multiple parameters to enable us to refine our look, and also keeping our blend files relatively small without a dependence on large external texture sets. We'll then combine our shaders into much more manageable node groups in order to use them to build a plastic material that has a super handy color input, so we can quickly create alternative colors using these same material properties. And with our main material completed, we'll take what we've learned to put together the remaining materials, including metal, decal material, and a lens material, which is super fast to render with screen space refraction, courtesy of the Eevee renderer. But fear not, although we'll be developing these materials for Eevee first, we'll also look at a way to adapt them slightly in order for them to work well within the Cycles engine, and how we can auto-switch between them depending on which engine you want to use. And by the end of this chapter, our basic bot will start looking way more appealing, and you could even render out a few still frames in celebration. Okay, let's jump into some shader nodes. In this video, we will look at smooth shading our model to avoid nasty polyfaceting. We'll also look at using the bevel modifier to clean up the normals of our hard surface and edges, as well as a few viewport options that can help us diagnose these mesh issues. Before we jump ahead into creating some snazzy materials for our basic bot, we need to remedy a few issues here, namely faceting. As you can see, we just go in and bring up our notations, we have some quite obvious faceting on the batteries, on the camera lens, on the joint here, and probably in other places. We can highlight this even further by going up to our viewport options and just checking cavity. And now we can really see the issues. So in order to fix that, we can select the body of our robot and then hit A on the keyboard to select all. This ensures that we have at least one mesh selected. And then right click and shade smooth. But we have another option here called shade auto smooth, which is a fairly new addition. And this is the one we want. As you can see, that has smoothed out things nicely. And if we go over to our options here, our mesh options, and toggle down normals, Auto Smooth has effectively checked this box, which includes this degree here. Any neighboring polygon which angle exceeds 30 degrees will be smoothed out. And as you can see, that has kind of worked, but we're still left with a few issues. As you can see here, we have subtle shading issues, and the batteries are particularly bad. If you're having trouble seeing these issues, we can change another handy viewport option by going up again to our viewport shading options, switching over to matte cap, and under the matte cap options here, we have various extreme matte caps that can really test our geometry. So I'm just going to select that one. And as you can see, there shouldn't be an immediate angle here. This should be a flat surface. Likewise here, and pretty much everywhere over the robot, really. So how do we fix that? Well, again, if we select our robot body and then hit A to select all, jumping over to our modifier options, we want to scroll all the way down to bevel, where if we toggle down the shader option here, we have the option to harden normals. Now we want to click this while holding down Alt so it affects all of our meshes here. And that has cleaned up things nicely. If we jump back to our studio and uncheck cavity and Alt-A to unselect all of our meshes, and you can see that it is very smooth without having any obvious mesh artifacts. And as a bonus, we have nice smooth bevels, which seem like they have a lot more segments than just one. With our normals all set up, we are ready to move on to creating some shaders. For this video, we will be creating 3 of 4 shader masks that will help us quickly create materials. These consist of an edge mask to create edge wear and discoloration, a dirt mask to isolate areas that collect dust and debris, and a roughness mask to ultimately break up the glossy uniformity for a more realistic result. We'll also group these nodes together in order to be able to use them from within any material. Okay, let's set up our shader masks. First, let's move up to the top right-hand corner of our viewport to drag out a new window, which we are going to change over to Shader Editor. You can also hit N on the keyboard over this window to hide this panel. Next, let's switch over to a material preview so we can see what we are doing. And select our main robot body here and move over to our material options. As you can see, we already have a material here, but if you don't, that's no problem. You can just go to the new button here and just call it something like base, as this is only going to be temporary for creating our shader masks. So let's give ourselves a bit more room and just zoom in here. And over our base color, let's just change it to something pretty extreme. Let's go with a purple here. And we want to apply this to all objects including our Boolean cutters. So if we just unhide those, and with our robot selected, hit A on the keyboard to select everything else, Control L, link materials. Now we can uncheck our hide collection and deselect everything with Alt and A. And it looks as though we have one slight issue, and that is because of our bevel. So let's go under our modifier options. And as you can see, if we go all the way to the bottom here, our material index has gotten to -1. I'm not sure why that happened, but now we can correct it with a quick click to the right. Okay, we are all set with the same material and can start building up our masks and seeing what it looks like over the entire robot. So first the edge mask, and we're going to use the ambient occlusion node to do this. If we Shift and A over our shader window and just go to search, and right at the top of the list is ambient occlusion. So let's click that and hook it up to see what it looks like. Doesn't look too different. Also, we can hook things up considerably faster with the Node Wrangler add-on. If you don't have it enabled, you can go up to Edit, Preferences, and under Add-ons, just search for Node Wrangler and make sure that that is checked. This will enable us to Control Shift and click our node and then preview it just as is. So as you can see, it's not doing anything, and that's because we need to jump over to our render options and switch on ambient occlusion. Okay, now we have something. And to set up our edge shader, I found we get more uniform results by lowering our samples down and checking inside and temporarily lowering our distance, and then finally searching for the invert node. And that fundamentally is our edge shader, and we'll be using that in the future to create subtleties over our material. So let's pack that into a group so we can reuse it in the future. So I'm just going to select both nodes here and hit Control G. There we're moved into an isolation mode, and we can drag out the distance here and plug it into our group input. Hitting Tab again to jump back out into our material, we can, I'm just going to give ourselves a bit more space here, rename it to Edge Mask Eevee. And just for security here, I'm going to check this false user button, which just makes sure it's saved with the scene, even if we don't use it. Okay, that's our edge done. Let's look at creating our cavity or dirt map. Again, we want to start with the ambient occlusion. Again, we want to reduce the samples. And this time, if we Control Shift and click, we see that we already have the beginnings of a dirt map. So I'm just going to increase the contrast with a gamma node. And as you can see, as we slide it up, we're starting to get a much stronger representation of the ambient occlusion node, which is going to work great for a dirt map. I'm just going to crank it all the way up to 10. And again, we have the distance scale here to help us achieve the desired effect. And the only other thing we need to check is local only. This is to ensure that no disconnected objects affect our ambient occlusion. And with that done, we can just select our nodes here, hit Control and G, and then we can just hook up our distance to the group input, tab back out. I'm just going to expand this and call it dirt mask Eevee, and again protect it with a false user. And finally, we want to create a roughness mask. This just breaks up the surface a little and gives it a bit more realism. And to do that, we need a procedural texture like Musgrave. Again, let's Control Shift and click. Now these are using generated coordinates, which aren't particularly even over the whole model. So to correct that, we need to hook up some new texture coordinates, and we can do so again with the help of Node Wrangler by hitting Control and T. And then switching from generated to object into our vector mapping. That looks a bit more uniform now. And back over to our Musgrave texture, we can increase the detail, decrease the dimension, and finally add a map range node at the end so we can avoid clipping values too much. I'm just going to adjust the scale a bit here. Okay, that looks good. Let's select all of our nodes again, hit Control and G. And this time we want to hook up a few more inputs. So we want one for scale, we want one for our min value, and one for our max value. And like before, let's just rename it Roughness Mask and protect it with a fake user. And we don't need to add an EV suffix to this one because it works well across both render engines. Okay, we have one more mask to create, and then we can properly start jumping into our material creation. Alright, this is our last mask node group before jumping into material creation. This one is a little bit more complicated to set up, but it will be totally worth it. In this video, we will look at setting up a string of nodes to procedurally create a mask for our scratches. We'll group them together and set up simple inputs to control the scale, length, width, and seed of our scratches. Okay, we're back and we have one more mask to create, our scratch mask. So first of all, let's just move our principal material off to the side here. And we don't want to connect the output here, so we can Control right click and draw a line, and that just deletes our noodle here. And we want to set up first a Voronoi texture. So we can do Shift and A, search Voronoi texture. And if we Control Shift and click, we see the output here. Things are very different scales, so we need to just unify everything by hitting Control T with our node selected and just change the generated to object vector. As you can see, I'm just going to Control space into our 3D viewport here. Some of the scaling is still wrong, and that is because I forgot to apply the scale on some of these items here, mainly the text decals. So let's just select all of those and just hit Control A and apply scale, and that will just snap it to the same sort of scale as everything else. Again, Control and space to jump back out to our previous view, and then we can look at setting up our scratches. So first thing is first, we need to duplicate. So we have two Voronoids. I'm just going to plug the vectors into both, and these will mask each other to create our nice scratches. So firstly, we'll change 1 from F1 to distance to edge. And now we can use these lines here as scratches, but we want to effectively just select only the very thinnest point here, and we want to invert it as well so those lines are white. We can do that all in one go with a math node set to less than. So less than being, it will select only the darkest pixels and bring them out as white. Let's just see what we are actually doing here. So here you can see what it's doing. It's probably better. And we need a very low threshold. So let's go with 0.001. Cool. Now we want to mask it with this one, which is already quite white. So if we were to mask it now by using, again, another math node, and this time on multiply, so that only the white values get shown through, we can see not much has changed. And this is because we need to, like we did with this one, just restrict and clamp some of the values of our second Voronoi texture. So to do so, we can use a map range node. This, when we hook it up and look through it here, is a lot similar to a levels adjustment in GIMP or Photoshop or similar. So we have input values here and output values. So if, for example, we wanted to change our dark points to white and our white points to dark, we can change our 2 min and max from 0 to 1 and 2 max from 1 to 0. And that just inverts it. And then we can bring our max down a little bit so that only the areas in white here allow our previous texture node to show through. Okay, that's looking like we're going in the right direction, but we need to adjust the scale as these scratches are huge. So we can do so by plugging in a value. Let's set it to 5 initially to mirror these into both of our scales. And now we can adjust them together to get some nice sort of micro scratches going on. This is looking pretty good, but all of these lines are perfectly straight, and we want to just have them, occasionally bend and just break up the uniformity a little bit. Just make them a little bit bigger and visible. Actually, I might just for this increase the width a little bit to make it more viewable. And now we can affect the location of these lines with another procedural texture. This time Musgrave. Again, let's use our object coordinates and plug the height into our location here. And this gives us quite a strong swirly pattern, which is cool, but not what we're looking for. So let's restrict the output of our Musgrave texture here so that the variables get sent rather than just being from 0 to 1. As we can see, it goes from very low values to very high values. Instead, we can restrict it again with a map range node and change the output or the 2 to 0.5 to 0.7, and this is very low contrast, so it is moving the location of our mapping here, but only very slightly. So let's look at the output. Yep, this is the kind of effect we want here. So as you can see, if we were to scale our Musgrave, you can kind of see what it's doing. It's bending things, but we don't want it to bend too much, so I think a scale of 5 is nice. Okay, we have a scale of 16 plugged into our Voronoi and a scale of 5 for our Musgrave. So let's just use a math node to unify those scaling, so we only have to adjust one variable here. And let's use a math and multiply our 16 by, let's go with 0.3, roughly. And now we have one unified scale to adjust how big we want scratches. But even if we go very large, you notice we never have a scratch line that overlaps. So we need to create a whole new network of the same so that we can put one on top of the other. So to do that, let's first add a layout frame. Hit F2 on the keyboard and just name it as scratch large, as these will be our large scratches. And we can select all of our nodes here, hit G and just grab them over our frame and they'll automatically populate it. And then we can select everything, hit Shift D and move it down and just rename this as scratch small. And now let's add these two together with a math node. Leave it on add here as we want to plug in our two outputs. Again, Control Shift and click to see the output of this node. And all it's done is just made our scratches brighter. That's because we need to go over to our value here and just change it to something else. As you can see, they're getting a lot smaller. So they're like little micro dings and scratches here and there. So we have a nice variety here. So larger scratches and smaller scratches. And as you can see, they easily overlap each other now. So it looks a little bit more realistic. So that is looking like the effect we want, but let's go one step further and group them together and give ourselves some control variables similar to how we have done with the other masks. So I'm going to select everything here, hit Control and G to group them together, and then focus in on our group input. Now, if we hit N on the keyboard over our shader window and go down to our group tab, we can add some inputs. I'm going to add 4. Firstly, scale, which will be our global scale for all of the scratches here. Then length, which will be the length of our scratches, which will be driven by our second Voronoi mask. Width, this will be how wide our scratches are. And lastly, seed. This will affect the coordinates of our scratches just so we can shift them around slightly if we don't entirely like the look. Okay, let's look at plugging those in. So I'm going to go full screen here with Control and Space. Firstly, scale, and that is these values here. And in order to plug them all in together, we can shift and right click across all of these noodles or strings, and then plug in our scale to that join. Now we don't need this value anymore, so we can remove that and do the same for our second pass. However, our value was a lot higher than this one by a factor of 3 roughly. So let's introduce another multiply math node and change it to 3. So we replicate this value. Let's jump out and test that. Control Space and Tab. Now let's give it a value of, let's say 15. Yeah, that's looking good. Let's jump back into our node. It's also worth noting that up in the input group option here, we can set a default value. So I'm just going to set it at 10. Okay, length. Now this will be controlled by this from max value of our mask here. So let's just plug that in to length on both. And our default value for length can be 0.5. So if we tab out and give ourselves a length of 0.5, that looks about right, but we can also increase it or decrease it if we want little dings. But let's stick with 0.5 for now. Again, jumping in, width is our threshold here. So we can plug that into our width and give it a 0.005. And finally, seed. Now we want to just add a random number in between our map range here and our location. So to do so, let's just add a math node, leave it on add, just duplicate it so we have 2. 1 goes here, 1 goes here, and the value we want to add is just our seed number. Okay, it looks kind of complex, but when we tab, we get this really nice simplified version. So we have the overall scale getting bigger and bigger, or smaller and smaller. We have the 2 passes or 2 scratch levels are large and small. We have length, can increase that or decrease it. And we have width. We don't really need to adjust that too much. I'm going to keep it at 002. And then seed. This is just in case, I don't know, let's say we have a scratch directly over a piece of text we need to read or something. We can just adjust our seed until that kind of moves out the way. And finally, let's just jump in here and name it Scratch Mask. And again, check the little shield here to protect it with a false user. There we have it, our 4 masks, and we are ready to move on to creating our material. In this video, we will be using our previously created mask shaders to create a base color, roughness, and bump map. Okay, we are finally ready to make some materials, and the first material we're going to create is a base plastic kind of material, but we're sticking with our 1980s sort of aesthetic, so we're going with a beige box with worn out edges and scratches all over it. But before we get started, we need to jump over to our render options and just make sure we have screen space reflections checked, drop that menu down, and also check refraction. And with that done, let's just select the body of our robot to make sure that we are on our base material and move over and just switch on our material preview. As you can see, we just see scratches as that was the last shader mask we had hooked up. So let's zoom out and grab our Principled BSDF. If you don't have it, you can just search for it here to add it. And let's instead plug that into our surface. And the first thing we're going to want to create is a color. So let's again search RGB, and we're going to go again for this beige kind of look. So we'll plug that in and start building out our first input, the base color. So let's grab a mix RGB shader. And for the factor here, we're going to use our edge mask. So let's plug that in, plug our color into color 1. And then for color 2, we're going to go with a sort of a burnt dark color. And we'll change the mix here from mix to multiply and see the kind of look we're going for. So let's hook that up to our principled BSDF and look through that instead. It's looking pretty good, but I think we can dirty up those edges even more with the help of a color ramp. Again, Shift A, search for color ramp, and we'll put it in between our edge mask and our factor, and then just bring up the edge mask ever so slightly. It's looking good. Just minimized it there. I'm going to tweak the saturation a bit. So let's rename this mix node so we know what it is. Let's call it edge wear and duplicate with Shift and D and move it over and just snap it onto this one. Our next one, we want to take advantage of our dirt mask here to do pretty much the same. So let's plug it into the factor of our second duplicated item, which if we hit F2, we can rename to dirt. And that's doing the opposite of what we want. So again, let's grab a ramp node, plug it in, and flip these values around. You can do that with this little drop down here, flip color ramp, and then we can dial in the kind of look we want. But that mask is looking a bit clean, so we can use our roughness mask to roughen it up a bit. So let's introduce another mix node and plug it in between our dirt and color ramp and just switch it to add. And we'll just add those two together simply. So the output looks a bit more like this. Let's just have a look at that. I think that's looking a little bit more nuanced. Okay, let's minimize these and Shift A to add another mix. And this we can hit F2 and rename scratches. Let's capitalize that. And this is the kind of color we want for our scratches, as if it's kind of worked through to a sub layer. So we want the scratch mask into our factor and increase our layer 2. So you can start to see these little scratches forming. Okay, everything is still looking kind of uniform. So let's start adjusting the roughness. So we can take our roughness mask and pretty much plug it straight in to see what it starts to look like. And now is a good opportunity as well just to note all of the different HDRIs we have to work with, because some will be better at accentuating the surface reflections. So let's just toggle the drop down here. And I'm going to select an HDRI with a little bit more light and dark variance. Boost the strength and rotate it around. We get some interesting details there, but let's look through the mask and see if we can make it a bit more interesting. So again, the white areas will be rougher, the dark areas will be shinier. I think we can add our edge and a roughness mask together. So let's bring up a mix RGB, one color as our edge mask and the other as our roughness. Just maximize that factor and look through it, and then switch our mix to add. And we can see it's rougher at the edges, which seems like it would make sense. And let's grab another color ramp to accentuate that. Let's look through our principled BSDF. Oops, make sure to plug that in. It's looking a bit more interesting with a kind of shiny surface until you get to the very edge. Okay, we're kind of losing these scratches a little bit here, and they would be pressed in. So let's just add a bump, plug our scratch mask into the height. And if you remember, our scratches are white, so we want to invert the effect on our bump. And I usually like to start at 0.1 as the bump is very strong. So let's plug that into our normals and look through. It feels nice. Those scratches are getting indented and you can see the light is catching it more on one side. Just going to add one more node to make the reflection slightly less scattered here. I'm going to introduce it between our roughness before we add it to our edge. So I'm going to search for gamma. The gamma node adds a gamma curve, so it's sort of similar to RGB curves doing this, but in a more compact node. So let's look through it and just turn down the effect by increasing the gamma. That looks nice. So now you can kind of see the reflection here, except for it's broken up ever so slightly, as if marks and fingerprints and the like are over it. Cool. That's our first material set up, and now comes the fun bit. In this video, we'll be creating a shader group including a principled BSDF for our plastic material. We'll also be keeping the flexibility to create different color iterations, as well as distributing those over our model. We'll also look at iterating on our new plastic material group to create a metal material group, as well as testing it in different HDRI environments. Now things are going to get a little bit easier, as we're going to group all of our shader nodes and create a few derivative colors and materials from it. So let's first move our RGB color slightly out the way, because we're going to be selecting all of our material nodes here, hitting Ctrl G to group them. As you can see, this is automatically hooked up a group input, which used to be our RGB node. So let's tab back out, and you can see we have our RGB material output. Let's bring those together, and we have our node group, which we can call plastic, and just protect that. Now, if we disconnect our RGB here and drag our color swatch from one to the other, we don't actually need this node at all. So let's just hit X and keep it very streamlined. This makes it also adjustable from the material options directly, so we can just expand our viewport to give us a bit more room to work with. So in order to create our alternative color, let's first choose an item to have it. I think the wing panels here would be good. So let's just go into edit mode and hit L on the keyboard with our cursor over our mesh to select all of the mesh based on our select linked options, and jump up and create a new material slot. And this time we just want to create a new one, call it base alt, as this will be our alternative color. And we don't want a principled BSDF hooked up. We want to add our group plastic, plug it in, assign it to our selected mesh, jump out into object mode and just give it a color. I'm going to go with a burnt orange like that. Now, in order to distribute that over the other areas of our model, let's select the items we want to have it included in, and then select our wing item last, hit Ctrl L and link materials over. This ensures that both of those materials are on all of these other objects. Now we can jump into edit mode, keeping those all selected. Hit Alt and A to deselect anything that might already be selected. And then, like before, we can hover over and hit L on all of the items we want to be orange, and then just hit assign. That is looking nice. There's one we missed here, and that is the hidden decal. So let's just make sure we copy over the materials, jump into edit mode, select it, go onto our base alt and hit assign. Now I think it would be nice to have a black plastic for some of the more utilitarian parts. So let's select that, and this time under our material base, if we click this number references how many objects currently use this material. If we click that number, we create a unique material that's basically a copy of the same material. This time we can name it base black for our black material, and then just change the color down to black or very near black. And then we can just go in, select everything we want to be black. I think the number here and here will be good too. And select our new black aerial and hit Ctrl L and link materials over. That's populated nicely because we only had one material slot, so it just overrides that material slot. However, in the case of our camera module here, we want to select the very front, hitting Ctrl and plus on the number pad just to expand the selection. Create a new material slot, select base black and apply. And we can do the same for our lens casing, but this time with Ctrl and L. Okay, that looks good. And now the only other material we want to create based on the plastic is a metal. So let's select an object that should be metal, like the screw. And again, we can hit the number next to it to make it unique, rename that metal. And we can do the same for our node group here. Make it unique, rename it metal, and protect it so that this is now a node group that is again available from our add menu, should we need a metal texture of a particular color. So this I'm just going to increase to make it very metallic. And if we jump into our nodes here, all we need to do is just crank up the metal to 1 and hit tab back out. And now we have very shiny metallic screws. And there are a few other areas that I feel should be metallic. The fins, definitely. So let's click those. Click our screws and link materials. this bracket here, click that and a screw, link materials, the join under our wing. Let's jump in, select the join, create a new material slot, and just select metal from the drop down and assign. And similarly, I think these little sliced out elements would be nice. Metal, create a new slot, select metal and assign. And lastly, it would be nice to have the entire base metal, just to create a nice sort of two-tone effect. So let's jump into our base here and select all of the polys we want to be metal. And then again, we can create a new slot, metal and assign. And throughout this process as well, it's always handy to check with different HDRI environments just to make sure everything is looking fine. You might need to go in and tweak things now and again, but for the most part, I am happy with these results. So let's move ahead and start building out our remaining slightly more complex materials. In this video, we'll be swapping out our plastic lens for a glass shader. We'll also create additional lens elements that, with refraction, start to really sell in the effect. We'll also look at mimicking the colourful tint of lens coatings. Then we'll look at brightening up our status lights with an emissive effect that seems to emanate from the centre of the light. And finally finish with some vertex colour attributes to colour our warning decal. Alright, let's start with the lens of our basic bot. So with it selected, I'm going to hit the period or full stop key on the number pad to frame it nicely. And we do not want the plastic material, we want a glass material. So let's go over to our material options, and then we can click the little cross here to remove the material slot, add a new material, and just call it lens. Now we have the principled hooked up here, we want to switch that for a glass. So if we select it, hit Shift and S, go to shader and glass, that just swaps it in place. Very handy. Now to make it a little bit more realistic, we can scroll down to our material settings, change our blend mode to alpha blend, check backface culling to remove some of these issues here, and also check on screen space refraction. This assumes that you have this option in our render options checked, refraction. Now lenses have multiple lens elements, so let's just look at adding those in quickly. So if we go / into isolation mode, snap to a side view and hit 5 on the keyboard to go into orthographic mode, jump into edit mode with tab, and with our large lens element selected, hit Shift and D and then Y to create a duplicate, scale it down a bit, and do the same one more time, scale it down, jump back out into object mode and out of isolation mode, and now we have multiple lens elements, which adds a little bit more visual interest. Just as an aside note, sometimes the lens ordering can go a bit wrong, like in this case here. This could be due to a number of issues, but mainly because the duplication happened in object mode and not edit mode. Again, this can be easily fixed by selecting the back, middle, and front, and then just hitting Ctrl and J to join the elements. This hasn't fixed our layer ordering here. In order to do that, let's snap in to the Y-axis looking down the lens, hit Tab to go into edit mode, select all, go up to mesh, sort elements, and we want view Z-axis. And in order to see this better, let's switch off our viewport overlays. This hasn't helped us at all, so let's just reverse that Z-axis. And that is the result we want. And you can also mess around with different variables, but Z-axis works well for this case. But maybe you've done all of that and jumped back out and you still don't see the lens elements. This is more likely than not to be due to the lens housing not extending back far enough. So if we just drag out a new window here, switch this to wireframe and snap to the right view, we can see in here our lens housing. We can just select that polygon like so, and then hit G and Y and move it back until we can see all of our lens elements. And now we can really tweak our refraction to see what it looks like. So I'm going to increase it slightly and increase the refraction depth. Now, as you can see, if we increase this too much, we start to run out of surrounding pixels. And this is where another variable in our render options can help. So if we jump back into our render options and thickness, if we increase that, then we have more of the surrounding scene to incorporate into our faux refraction effect. But introducing refraction isn't the only thing we need to do to mimic a lens. As you can see from this fairly modern lens, there is also a coating which affects the color of the surface, normally a sort of shift between cyan and magenta as you appreciate the lens from different angles. So let's look at mimicking that now. Firstly, we can use a shader node that will help us change color based on angle, and that is the layer weight. Here we have a Fresnel and facing. And we're going to use the facing as if you go to an extreme glancing angle here, it turns to a high value or white, or face on is dark or a low value. We can use that along with a color ramp. Let's just hook those up to create a magenta. Let's go with a dark kind of magenta and then a cyan color based on that principle. Now let's plug that into the color of our glass and hook that up. It's looking good, adding a nice bit of visual interest. We can also introduce a gamma node between the layer weight and color ramp if we want to tweak the fall off. Now this is looking good, but for me it's a little bit too saturated and dark. So let's just duplicate these chain of nodes here and mix them together in order to reduce the saturation ever so slightly in the center of the lens. So let's just hook up our second chain. We want the center of the lens to be more of a white, maybe slightly off white, and the incidence angle or the glancing angle as very dark. Let's add that on top with a screen mode and plug it into our color 2 and look at our glass shader. Now we can tweak the variables here so we get some of that color back, but I think that looks nice. Now we have all of that set up. We can do a final pass adjusting our refraction. Cool, I am happy with that. And in later videos, we can rig these lens elements to sort of focus, zoom in and out, just to give that little bit of extra character. Okay, our lens element is done. Let's move on to addressing these little lights here. So I'm just going to select them and hit the period or full stop key to frame them nicely. Now we have, well, we want two shaders in here. We want to keep the plastic border, but add a new light material. So let's go over to our material options and just create a new slot and a new material and just call it status light. Jumping into edit mode, we can just select the frontmost polygon here and then Control and plus to expand our selection. Then highlight our status light material and click assign. Okay, I think a blue would be a nice color that would complement the orange that we've been using. So let's choose a somewhat darker blue for the actual diffuse material here. I think it would be made out of plastic, so it wouldn't be particularly rough. It'd be nice and shiny. And the emission, I think we can go for a very bright blue, almost a cyan. Now that's kind of okay, but we can finesse this more with our good friend, the layer weight. So let's hook up the facing to our emission strength. As you can see, that's causing the glancing angles to have a stronger emission, but we want the opposite, as if there's a small bulb kind of nested in this. So let's bring up a invert node, and we want that effect to be stronger. So let's bring up a math node, change it to multiply, and increase the values to something like 10. It's looking a bit better. It would be nice to adjust the gamma of this or the fall off. So let's introduce a gamma node and put it between our invert and multiply. Here we can tweak the settings and that's looking good. So it kind of shimmers. Now, in order to fully take advantage of this layer weight, it might even be worth adding a little bit more geometry. So if we go into our light with the tab button and just select our top polygon and again expand it with Control and plus, and then Control and B to add a bevel. Okay, let's commit to that. And now you can see you get much more of a nested emission type of vibe. And that mixed with a bloom effect, I think will work very nicely. Yeah, that's looking nice. All right, we have one more material to create, and that is our decal on the bottom of our vent here, which we can't see. So let's switch over to solid mode and go down to object. And there, as you can see from where we previously set it up, we can see our individual colors, making it a lot clearer. Now with our decal selected, we can just join these two up with Shift and left click and then Control and J. And then we can look at another way to color these without having to assign multiple materials. And that is using Vertex Paint. So in order to paint this, we can jump into the Vertex Paint option with Control Tab and go to Vertex Paint and then switch on our Poly Select mode up here in the top left hand corner. And now we can hover over elements we want to color. So I think the warning triangle here should definitely be red. So with our cursor over that, we can hit L on the keyboard and then choose a red color and then just fill the vertices with that color. You can either do that up here with Paint, Set Vertex Colors, or as you probably saw from the shortcut here, Shift and K. So let's just Alt and A to deselect everything. Go again and hit L for these elements, which I think should probably be black along with these. So we can just get our boundary select tools, Shift select the other elements here, and then Control L to select linked. Go back to our paintbrush, select a black color, and then do Shift and K. Now we can do Alt and A to deselect everything, and go to our select tool again, or hit B on the keyboard to just select the remaining items. Hit Control L just to make sure they're all selected. And this time I think we can go with a nice warning sign yellow. Shift and K to fill, and then we can jump back out into object mode. Now if we move back over to our material preview, we can see that not a lot has happened, and that is because we need to create a new material over in our material options here. Tapping the number to create a unique material, just calling it warning. And now we can use the color attributes we've just created, which you can see under our mesh options. Under color attributes is called col. We can load that up. If we go to input attributes, you might see it here, col. Or if you don't, you can just go to attributes and type in the name manually and then hook it up like so. Excellent. Okay, that's our last material for BasicBot done. However, there is one tiny remaining material, and that is our world material. So let's look at setting that up next. So far, we have been relying on the built-in environment maps that ship with Blender. However, to give ourselves more of a tailored look, we're going to look at sourcing our own HDRI and setting it up. So if we move over to our rendered view here, you can see it looks much the same, but if we trigger the drop down and just check scene lights and scene world, you can see it looks pretty bland. And this is because if we switch over here to our shader window and go from object to world, all that is hooked up is just a gray background. But where can we source some nice high resolution, high dynamic range environment maps to use with our basic bot? A great option is Polyhaven that have a fantastic range of HDRIs. Now the one that I quite like is Large Corridor. So let's just click that. And 2K HDR is plenty. So let's just download. After storing our file in our project folder, we can load it into our world shader. In order to do so, let's do Shift A and search for environment texture. Now we can open, locate our HDR and plug it into our color. Now in order to tweak the orientation, with our texture selected, we can hit Ctrl and T. This is again a node wrangler feature, and then rotate about the Z or Z. You can rotate about the other options, but then this will cause some perhaps unnatural effects. Something like that is nice. We catch the highlights nicely in the lens, and we have a nice bit of material gloss here. I think we can increase the power as well, so let's just turn the strength up until we're happy. But we don't want to see the environment in our background. So in order to rectify that, let's jump back over to our world shader, hit Shift A and search for Mix Shader. Now we want another background, so let's Shift A and search for background. Let's go with a neutral kind of grey, plug that in, and then search for light path. Now we have an option to use the camera raise as our factor to mix these two backgrounds together. And this will have the effect of the camera seeing only this background, but everything else like the reflections and refractions using this background. So now let's just adjust it slightly. And there we have our own custom environment map, nicely reflecting all of the shaders and the like. And we still have a nice uniform background. Okay, our shaders are done. And we could move on to the next chapter. However, it might be worth also setting this up to render in cycles. So in the next video, we will look at doing just that. So far, we've been setting up our materials for Eevee, and why not? It's a lightning fast renderer, and we can adopt a what you see is what you get workflow that doesn't rely on having to produce many test renders. I'm also conscious that not everyone has super expensive graphics cards at their disposal. That being said, Cycle's path tracer prowess serves up even more realism, shaking off the video game-like aesthetic that Eevee can sometimes have. So in this video, we will look at adapting our materials to cycles, as well as setting up our nodes in order to pipe different materials to different renderers. Alright, we have our materials nicely set up, but what if you want to use cycles instead of Eevee? These materials look good, but sometimes you can't beat the accuracy of a path tracing renderer. Let's first have a look and see what it looks like in cycles by going over to our render options and changing our render engine to cycles. As you can see, we are also on our rendered view. And as you can see, it looks pretty horrible. So let's look at fixing that. Firstly, we can drag out a new window and have one on material view and one on our rendered view, making sure just to toggle the scene lights and world for our material view, just so we have parity between them. Now with our main body selected, let's go over from world to object shaders and jump over to our material options and just select base, as this is the most visible material. In order to create a version that works in cycles, we effectively have to run two materials on the mesh. But thankfully, we have this handy option here where we can assign each to their individual render engine. So in order to do that, let's just select these two, hit Shift D and duplicate it down. Then we can have our top one as Eevee, our bottom one as cycles. And now if we just drag out here and click the number to create a unique shader group and call it plastic.cycles and protect it. Now if we select that newly created group, go into the group with tab, this is the culprit. This is the thing that's making it look horrible. And the reason it doesn't look quite as good in cycles as it does in Eevee is because of how Eevee approximates ambient occlusion. It doesn't know the thickness of these panels here. It's just a screen space effect that's put on top. Whereas if we switch to cycles, you can see because it's path traced, it knows the thickness and it knows more than just what the camera sees. So we're going to have to look at a different method. So again, let's click the number, change Eevee to cycles and hit tab to jump into that. Now we need to create a new nodal flow here that works with cycles, as clearly this does not. So a nice way to create a cycles edge shader is to use the bevel node and calculate the distance with a vector math to the normals. Let's just change that from add to distance. And now the output, if we plug it into our group output, has a similar effect, highlighting the edges. Although this is quite strong, so I think we can introduce a map range node and just turn down the output to 0.4. And again, we can use our distance input here to control the radius. Okay, looking good. We don't need these two nodes anymore, so we can just hit X on the keyboard to remove those, and then tab to jump out. And while we're at it, let's also protect our new shader, just in case we drop it out for some reason, and look at updating the other materials. So I'm just going to click on the wing here, as we have base Alt, So like before, let's just select those two, duplicate, have one as Eevee, one as cycles, and then on our plastic dropdown, we just want to select our new plastic.cycles. And let's select our Wi-Fi antenna type things here. And again, the same, Shift D, one as Eevee, one as cycles, and just change that node group. We also have the metal here to deal with. So let's just do the same, duplicate it down, one as Eevee, one as cycles. We need to adjust our shader group for metal here by hitting the 2 to create a unique version, and add the suffix cycles. Jump in and change our edge mask Eevee to edge mask cycles, and jump back out with Control and Tab. Now the only remaining material is our little warning sign here, so we can jump in and have a look at that. It's looking quite dark. And select our node group, duplicate it, Eevee, cycles, plastic cycles. And that's brought back the color. Okay, that's looking significantly better. So we have a nice Eevee option for super quick turnaround, and we have a cycles option in case we want that extra bit of fidelity. And that brings us to the end of our material chapter. In the next chapter, we will begin the process of breathing some life into our basic bot. So let's save our work, and I'll see you in the next video.